Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving, Doreen.
Thank you. Turkey Day.
Hopefully everybody we are actually recording this before Thanksgiving, but hopefully everybody had a really nice celebration. We sure are planning to. First, I want to address the video last week because it upset a few commenters, and what upset them was not so much the content of the video, but really the title. And I think some people may even have been turned off from watching the video because of the title. The title I originally had was Being Saved Means Joining a Community.
Just a community?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think some people took it to mean that in order to be saved or in order to be a follower of Jesus, you needed to join a community like the Bruderhof. And that is not at all what I meant. I thought the title was actually quite self-explanatory, but then I showed it to my wife, Roxanne, and she said, yeah, that's a stupid title. So I changed it.
Yeah, I guess, maybe some people found it too prescriptive, or we are Americans, so we don't like being told.
We don't like being told
what the remedy is.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But I think, I am going to push back a bit and say, being a disciple of Jesus does mean being part of a community. It just does. You can't be a Christian by yourself. It means being part of the church, which is an embodied fellowship of people. Jesus' last prayer is, may they all be one. So, sorry if that offends.
And note that Rich says a community, not this community,
right,
or the Bruderhof community. Obviously, we wouldn't be here if we didn't think this was a way to go.
Right, right. So hopefully that clarifies things. Now on to some more controversy.
Yay!
Christian communism. The first section in this chapter is made up of two sections. The first section is by Jose P. Miranda, who was a Mexican theologian. He's also studied economics, which I guess why his interest in sort of the economic model of the early church. And the second section is by Protestant theologian Helmut Gollwitzer, student of Karl Barth. Doreen, any thoughts on this chapter?
I would say when I first read through chapter 7, I took issue with the word communism in the Christian context because I think communism directly implies a political construct. And as Christians, how we live out our faith cannot be political at all, because I don't think Jesus' commands were political. And ultimately, living in community is not about how it's constructed. It's about trying to be true to Jesus' teachings and commands. So, Rich, that was my initial reaction, was that communism is a word that shouldn't even be used in this book, let alone in the Christian context.
Okay, well, I guess I would push back a bit that I do think being obedient to Jesus' commandments is going to be construed as political. It was construed as political in his time. He was seen as a political threat. Now, not politics in the sense of joining a political party and being part of sort of like the integralist vision of the church having a say in the politics of this world. But I understand your objection. And actually, Jose P. Miranda, his piece, which is an extract from his book Communism in the Bible, he addresses basically three objections, anti-communist objections to this reading of the Bible, specifically to the Lucan accounts of common ownership in the early church. The first objection he responds to is that other New Testament writers fail to corroborate Luke's account. We don't read of Jesus telling people you should live in community, and that's one of those common arguments. But his response to that is there is no part of the New Testament that actually contradicts those accounts. In fact, even though they may not explicitly recommend that way of life, they do support I mean, Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount do, as we've discussed in previous videos, do support this idea of a shared common life. The second anti-communist allegation against the text we have cited from Luke is that the communism of the first Christians failed. Right, and this is an interesting objection we hear often, right? They must have abandoned it because it didn't work.
Or eventually not everyone received the appropriate help that they needed, or things fell apart.
Right. And Miranda's response, I think, is good. You know, failure is not, the fact that something failed does not mean that it was a bad thing. It just means that people weren't able to do it. People
human.
failed. And he said by the same, you know, to cite that initial failure as pure pretext. It is as if we told ourselves we were eliminating the Ten Commandments because they failed in history. So, anyway, that's a good response. The third objection, now this is an interesting one because it has to do with the story we've talked about, right? The story of Ananias and Sapphira.
Yeah.
You want to recount that real quick?
Well, that's, we've discussed this, but it's definitely one of the more challenging and shocking stories in the Bible where they lied and said that they had indeed sold everything, but then they held back money as a little safety net for themselves and ended up paying for it with their lives.
Yeah, it's a pretty shocking story in the Acts of the Apostles. But Miranda picks up this one line where Peter tells Ananias, was the property or the money not still yours if you kept it, and once you sold it, it was not yours to dispose of? Now, some people would look at this and say, okay, Peter's actually saying you actually had the option to keep it, but the problem was that you lied. And Miranda's interpretation is that's not what was happening. According to Luke, what is optional is not communism, but Christianity. Peter does not tell Ananias that he could have come into the Christian community without renouncing the private ownership of his goods. Nor could he say such a thing after it was explicitly emphasized that the Christians, not a single one, said anything was his. Ananias lied to the Holy Spirit by pretending to become a Christian via a simulated renunciation. So basically, Peter wasn't saying you could be part of the Christian community as long as you didn't lie and you could have kept your money, saying, no, you pretended to be a Christian by giving your stuff up. So the option is not an option to renounce your wealth. The option is to not become a Christian.
Right. You can't just pay lip service to what you're doing and then not actually do it.
Yeah. So basically, Miranda is emphasizing, I think, the prescriptive nature of renouncing wealth in becoming a disciple of Jesus. What is optional is to be a Christian, to be a disciple of Christ, not optional to hold on to your wealth and be a Christian. That leads right into this part from Helmut Gollwitzer. Like I said, Protestant theologian, student of Karl Barth. And he was a Christian socialist as well. Wrote a pretty neat piece called Why Am I a Christian, a Socialist, or something like that. I don't know how the translation works. And he's also responding to objections.
And I think, I read Gollwitzer. Do you say Gollwitzer? And he also addresses kind of the atrocity of how most of us perceive communism and how people have, especially in the Soviet Union and other places, suffered horribly under what, was supposed to be the greatest good for all. So he says, yes, that was a voluntary communism, a communism of love.
That's referring to
early Christians. The early Christians and Luke's descriptions. So that was a communism of love, not a horrible communism of force like we saw in the Soviet bloc. So he does go right there.
But then he says, right, so you don't like the forced communism.
Right.
But then show me your free willing communism if you're a Christian. Because the goal of Christian fellowship should be that no one within the fellowship or beyond it suffers economic need or want.
And the political construct came from a deep need and physical starvation of people. And then he also talks about the spiritual starvation of the masses and how, it's so necessary to minister to people who really want the message of Christ and not be afraid to do that. And how life-changing that can be, not just for your mental and spiritual health, but also like physically caring for each other and implementing that. So I understand his position for sure.
But he talks about like the challenge today, like, because of communication technology, because we are in some ways able to be more aware of material need around us, it almost seems impossible for us. We can't help seeing the millionfold need of humankind, and we feel it is impossible. This can only mean one thing: becoming a Christian today is beyond us. We can understand why today many Christians suggest one should understand the gospel altogether differently, that one should not apply it to social relationships, but only to community with God and the consolation of the forgiveness of sins. And this is what you'll hear from people. This is not possible. The Sermon on the Mount is an impossible ideal. Can't be we can't actually live this out. But he points to something that I think is really important. We tend to think of sins as like our personal misdeeds, stealing,
lying,
covetousness, lying. But there's also the sin of being involved in a social order where some people have lots and some people have little. And you can say, like, well, I look around us, right? We have many impoverished people in our local area. And you can sort of wring your hands and say, we can't solve any of these problems. But then does that lead you to say we can't do anything? We can't overcome that in some small way? I mean, we absolutely do need forgiveness for the fact that we have more than other people. But his forgiveness of sins can never mean carry on just as before.
Yeah. And I think, that kind of makes me remember and realize why most of us joined the community, obviously, was because there seems to be no other way to go and address the multitudes, the needs that just abound everywhere. And someone was actually talking in one of our church meetings the other day about that, how their parents joined the Bruderhof. They were incentivized by a mission trip where his father just felt so completely helpless and spent, having given himself to the impoverished people he was ministering to every day without any effect or any way of addressing it on his own. And that's why he ended up here. And so that is powerful, because people are looking for a way to address that and to find freedom from the constant burden of that. So just living it out every day.
Well, and that's where he ends. That's where Goldwitzer ends here, is talking about freedom.
And I thought that was really cool as well.
This is where I thought was really great.
Okay, so the praising of God and the sharing of possessions, the Lord's Supper and the common table, the vertical and the horizontal, a complete life is present in the true resurrection of the church. And a complete life is key. And that's what we strive to live. And the horizontal is the manifestation of what happens, concealed in the vertical. The horizontal, our relationship with others, is the test of the genuineness of the vertical, our relationship with God. Do you want to read the last part about freedom?
He keeps going on here. It is all one freedom, the freedom of rejoicing in God, our freedom toward other people, and the freedom never to say, that belongs to me. So hopefully this is an encouragement to you in the face of what often seems impossible situations, impossible to solve humanly. We can still, in small fellowships, in some small communities, find this freedom of renunciation, freedom in our relationship to God through forgiveness of sins, freedom in our relationships to each other through sharing, where we don't have privilege and put ourselves above or below others. And that's an amazing gift of community. So I think that's good for this one.
Yeah. See you guys next time.
All right then. Have a good one.